of the runway. Hangar number 2 is where Rivet Ball lived. I lived right off the end of the wingtip, and Rivet Amber was in hangar number 3, and they lived with their airplane too. We would be out there a week, sometimes 10 days, all dependent on the weather. The weather was so bad at Shemya that often we would be out there 10, maybe 12 days, whatever it took to get the airplane to be able to land and return us and cycle with the other crew. Shemya has a nickname as the Rock because there's no trees and there's no women. We had an old saying that behind every tree there's a woman, but you'll never find a tree on Shemya. It had the worst weather in the world. We've had several aircraft accidents there. I'll talk to you about that as we go along. But let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is where we went to work. The 3 long streaks, numbers 1, 2, and 3, that's where the Soviet Union launched their missiles from, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they would track in and go into this Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the Klyuchi test range. The little symbol of the airplane, that represents where Rivet Ball and Rivet Amber were. We would stay outside beyond in the international water area where it was legal to do what we were doing. Nevertheless, the security service guys in the back would keep a close watch, listen to the fighters. Once in a while, we would get a fighter intercept. More often than not, we were left alone, but we never really knew what was going to happen. And you could go down just so far. We had to go down because all our data was taken off the right side of the airplane. And it was very important to have the airplane start up high on the orbit and come on down, because if you went down too far, you'd cross land, then you could get in trouble and they could bite you. Go to the next slide. Well, on the 13th of January, 1969, Rivet Ball with Team 2 in the back end was returning from an operational mission from the Klyuchi test range. And conditions on the runway seemed adequate, and John Aker was the aircraft commander at the time, and he set up a normal landing pattern, came in, everything was looking normal. This is about 12:30 at night on the 13th of January, and the last 1,000 feet was slush. Next thing you know, he knew he was going off the end of the runway. So quick thinking, they shut down the alternators. This was on 2-8 where they were landing, veered off to the right so they wouldn't impact the telephone poles that supported the approach lights. Went down a 40-foot embankment and broke in half. Fortunately, nobody was seriously hurt. The co-pilot was injured a little bit, but not too bad. The next slide. This is a picture of Rivet Amber that very few people have ever seen. We made a home movie. It's called A Place Called Shemya, and dedicated it to the crews that were lost on Rivet Amber. This picture right here was taken from an 8mm film blown up, and the 19 crew members down below are the ones that were lost. Backtracking a little bit, I had gotten a call return after we lost the Rivet Ball airplane. I started flying in Rivet Brass. Rivet Brass missions were Soviet peripheral reconnaissance. Coming back and recuperating from one of the missions, I got a phone call from Colonel Jim Clary, and he says, "Congratulations, King." And I said, "What for?" He says, "You got promoted to major." I said, "Well, that's not possible. I've got a couple of years to go yet." And he says, "No." He says, "You got your orders." He said, "You come down here and get them." So I went down to the squadron, met the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Myron C. Bowen at the time. And he says, "Congratulations." He says, "By the way," he says, "I'm going to the lower 48. My son's going to get married. Would you like to be the squadron commander while I'm gone?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir." So on the 5th of June, I showed up at the 24th Strategic Reconnaissance Garden as the squadron commander, wondering what I'm going to do, and the first thing I did, I made a big pot of coffee. I handed out some paperwork, and I gave some briefings, and I answered a few phone calls. Well, about 2 hours into the morning, I got a phone call from the command post, and they said Rivet Amber had departed Shemya with a non-operational mission, direct flight back to Eielson for maintenance. And they said they'd missed their ops normal report time. And I said, "Well, okay, keep me informed. Not something to panic about, maybe something just delayed them a little bit. We'll hopefully hear from them." Then about 20 minutes later, I got another call on the phone. He says, "The wing commander wants to see you down on the command post." I went down to command post, and the wing commander, he was only on the job 1 day. I had been on since about 2 hours. He says, King, he says, we have a problem. We can't make contact with Vivid Amber. He says, you're a close friend and know everybody. I've been up there about 2.5 years. I was getting ready to, not too far from rotating out. He says, get a close friend of each of the wives and the chaplain and go break the news. After I finished that, I went home and wept. That was the worst of times. The best of times was the day before, congratulations on promotion. The next day was losing all these people. Everybody was shocked. We couldn't believe it. But we did have some communications from the airplane that Elmendorf recorded, and I'm going to read you some of that. These are the last communications ever received from Vivid Amber. At the time, its call sign was Irene 92. At 1736 Zulu, Irene 92 sends this: Elmendorf Airways, Elmendorf Airways. Irene 92, Irene 92, over. Irene 92, Elmendorf, go ahead. Elmendorf Airways, Irene 92, experiencing vibration in flight. Not certain of the emergency. We have the aircraft under control. Irene 92. This is Elmendorf. You say you're not declaring an emergency. Is that Charlie? You hear a keying of a transmitter. Heavy breathing. Roger. Crew, go to oxygen. At this time, I'm sure the pilot accidentally tripped the interphone switch instead of the HF and sent that message. Then Elmendorf comes back and says, this is Elmendorf. Say again, Irene 92, Elmendorf. Elmendorf continued to try and make contact, and all you could hear were key clicks. Those key clicks lasted for 45 minutes. And that was the last we ever heard. This took place about 45 minutes after they took off from Shimya. So the wing commander started the search and rescue effort with the Coast Guard. And then we started our own search and rescue effort. I remember getting up in a tanker with a cardboard apple box and a whack chart, drawing squares. And we sort of like an airborne command post, and we would take all the airplanes we could get out of Eielson, and we even borrowed some later into the week from the 55th. And we gave them cameras, and we gave them binoculars, anything to help. And we covered every square foot from Shimya all the way up to the mainland. It took us about 2 weeks. We found nothing, no debris, no people. We heard all kinds of misinformation. And the one thing I learned from that accident was when something like that happens, the first data you get most likely is not true. It's very false. And when you get eyeball to eyeball, then you find out what the truth is. People